Alright, the plots that we have discussed so far should not have come as a big surprise to you. However, the next one might be perplexing, so brace yourself. Look at this. A man leads a woman by the hand towards a sitting person. In his other hand is a leash, and on it a three-headed dog. That doesn't seem very Christian. Well, that's because it's not. This three-headed dog immediately allows us to identify the story. What is narrated here is one of the Hercules' labors. The three-headed dog is respectively Cerberus, a monster guarding entrance into the world of the dead. You might recall that capturing Cerberus was Hero's final mission. However, there is a mix-up here, for the woman being led by Hercules refers to a different story. Do you notice how skillfully I'm building up anticipation? Don't worry, I'm not going to drag it. The woman's name is Alceste, and the sitting man is her husband Admet. The plot is taken from Greek mythology, specifically from the tragedies of Euripides, Alceste, the name of the tragedy is. King Admet gets the opportunity not to die in his due time, but he must find a volunteer who would take his place and descend into Hades instead of him. Both his parents refuse, and his son he doesn't dare to ask. But his faithful wife Alceste suddenly volunteers to die, so that her husband would have an extra time on earth. And Admet accepts her sacrifice. Interestingly, a good portion of Euripides' tragedy revolves around his moral dilemma and Admet's attempts to rationalize his own behavior. Is it his father's duty to replace a younger son? After all, his time on earth is so meager that it's not worth preserving. A life of an old person isn't equally valuable as a life of a young person. Or is it? Moreover, is it a wife's duty to offer life in those circumstances? And could her husband's willingness to accept be considered merely as cowardice? Those are good questions. I'm not even going to try to resolve it now. But it's an interesting topic for you to ponder. The relative value of a human life might be a great topic for a cocktail party or for a friendly chat. Well, if your friends are anything like my friends, at least. Anyhow, on a due day, everyone is preparing for the arrival of demon of death that would take Alceste away. And suddenly, an unexpected guest appears. That guest is none other than Hercules himself, an old friend of Admetus. He's not aware of the whole situation, and Admet does not want to upset him. So they sit down to feast. Admet doesn't tell him anything, and what follows is Hercules getting drunk and starting harassing and mocking the servants. A quick side note. It is interesting that ancient authors like to portray Hercules as a typical redneck, or if you will, a gym bro. He's big and strong, but he isn't the sharpest pencil in the box. Also, he is prone to abuse alcohol. Hercules is the embodiment of physical power. He is steep in all kinds of physical pleasures, and not always capable of restraining himself. And so, Hercules gets drunk and starts picking at servants, saying, "Why are you so gloomy? We're sitting here, relaxing, having fun, and you, with your sulky faces, you're killing the mood." At some point, one of the servants can't stand it anymore, so he tells Hercules about their grief for Alceste, which he flagrantly disrespects. Hercules is first confused, then shocked, and finally he volunteers to confront the demon of death himself and rescue Alceste from him. After all, that is not his first time to perform such a heroic deed. What for a regular person is unimaginable, for Hercules is just another workday. And sure enough, Hercules fights death, defeats it, and brings Alceste back, holding her by the hand, which is exactly what is depicted here. But he is also pulling Cerberus on a leash. Isn't that confusing? Well, on the one hand, it is clear that Cerberus alludes to the underworld, to the eerie kingdom of Hades from which Alceste is being rescued. But on the other hand, in the tragedy of Euripides, nothing is said about this three-headed monster dog. So apparently, the artist simply took a liberty and merged the two plots, so that it would be clear exactly which character is depicted. After all, is there a more coherent reference to Hercules than a tamed Cerberus? So, in this case, an underworld creature isn't contributing to the story, but rather serves as a character attribute. At this point, you may ask, why are you showing me this image? What does it have to do with our topic, the Christian catacombs? Well, you see, it's not always clear whether a particular chamber or a burial place in catacombs was used by Christians or by pagans. This particular image was found in the catacombs on Via Latina, an ancient road leading to Rome. In the chamber from which this image was taken, there are several more images of Hercules' labors. There seems to be nothing Christian about them. However, in the adjusting chambers, some Christian imagery was discovered. And it seems likely that those chambers might belong to the same family, which often was the case. So it is possible that what we are dealing with here is adaptation of pagan plots to the Christian worldview. We have already seen how certain pagan images could be used in Christian context. But here we have a further development of the same trend. The subject remains clearly pagan. However, it is quite possible to interpret the story about Hercules in a Christian manner. After all, he is battling and conquering death, just like Christ, who defied death itself and triumphed. And why not assume that for the Christian viewer, this image of Hercules returning Alceste to life could remind of image, say, of Christ resurrecting Lazarus? Of course, Hercules cannot be deemed a type, in the same sense that John, swallowed by the whale, was deemed the type of Christ. But it can be deemed a reminder, a cultural parallel, an allusion devised for a former pagan who has accepted Christian doctrine but did not repudiate his pagan culture and education. For him, such image was long familiar and emotionally appealing. And it very well could be that early Christians would not object such a mixture, a pagan hero in a Christian burial chamber. After all, we have already established that pagan and Christian cultures at that time, they were constantly intermingling. Of course, there is no complete certainty that this image was made by Christian or by pagan, but it is quite possible that it was made for Christian who was a former pagan. And yes, such amalgamation of symbols might seem bizarre to us, but that is very important to keep in mind that in that time it was not only imaginable, but it was common. And while we are on the subject, let me show you a few more examples when the line between Christian and pagan images turns out to be elusive. Look, for example, at this picture. This is a painting on a ceiling. On the sides we have the story of Jonah, which you have already seen, and in the middle, a mysterious figure on a flying chariot. And since the overall context is clearly Christian, we can assume that this is God, God the Father to be exact. However, this version of God is suspiciously similar to Helios, the solar god, because that's exactly how the ancient Greeks imagined him, a radiant chariot riding across the sky. And once again, an absolutely pagan image is being borrowed and appropriated for Christian patrons and viewers. But wait, there's more. There is an even more striking example. This one. This mosaic comes from the Mausoleum of Julius, which is a part of the so-called Vatican necropolis, which is in turn a complex of underground tombs located directly under the Vatican, in fact under St. Peter's Cathedral. Our data on it is sketchy, but as far as we know, this particular chamber was accidentally opened by workers at the end of the 16th century, then closed again, and then it was rediscovered during excavations in 1940-1941. Unfortunately, for some reason, I managed to find only a handful of images from this tomb. It is quite possible that the Vatican is against them being published. So, there is a little Da Vinci Code style hint for you. What sort of blasphemy might those chambers conceal? Okay, let's get real here. I have no idea as to what extent Vatican is interested in keeping those findings away from public attention. But like I said, it is a possibility. Because some of those images might definitely make a very strong and very wrong impression on an uninitiated viewer. This mosaic being case in point. A certain young man, again on a chariot, and sun rays are being radiated from his head. And next to him, vines of grapes. That detail immediately establishes the Christian context of the whole image. I have already explained that grapes usually allude to blood of Christ and to the Eucharist. I have already shown you examples of how Christians decorate their tombs with vines, and that tradition persisted throughout all the Middle Ages. In addition, there are other mosaics in the same tomb which are obviously Christian. Therefore, there is no doubt about the Christian context in which this image should be examined. So let's examine it then. And the first question to consider would be, who is on the chariot? On the one hand, it is logical to assume that this is God himself. But which God precisely? God the Father? Well, he is obviously too young to be the Father. All of his features, long hair, small beard, allude to Christ. And although the iconography of Christ was still in its development stage at that time, some basic attributes were already assigned to him, and the tradition to represent him as a young and long-haired person has been established. But that being said, he is also very reminiscent again of Helios. Just look at the sun rays around his head. It should be mentioned that the Greek Helios was no longer massively worshipped at that time. Instead, in the Roman Empire, his cult merged with the Eastern solar cults and transformed into the cult of a god whom the Romans called Sol Invictus, that is, the invincible sun. He was more of an abstract solar deity, an embodiment of unstoppable life force. His cult was particularly promulgated by Roman authorities and gained an impressive popularity among militants. Apparently, in this case, the image of Christ merges with the image of the invincible sun. Now let's move on to examples even more perplexing. Here, we have a young man with big round eyes, wearing a strange cap, the top of which bends forward. He is playing a harp, and trees around him are swarming with birds. Who is it? Well, clearly this is Orpheus. And no, not the one from the Matrix movie. Let's start by recapping the myth. As the story goes, Orpheus was a musician from Asia Minor, from Phrygia, which is roughly present-day Turkey. Such was his talent that he could tame wild animals with his beautiful singing. That is exactly how he is usually depicted, surrounded by tranquil animals who abandon their violent ways while in his presence. You may also remember the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice, Orpheus' wife. She dies after being bitten by a snake. her faithful husband goes down to the underworld after her, charms Hades with his music, and gets permission to take his wife back. There is only one condition. On his way back to Earth, as Eurydice is following him, he is forbidden to turn around and look at her. And here they are, almost out, almost on the surface again. Salvation is so close, and the daylight is already looming in the distance. And that is the exact moment that Orpheus, being torn by doubts, loses control of himself and looks back. Immediately his wife flees. He tries to follow, but access to underground world for him is now forbidden forever, and all hope is lost. That is a sad story indeed. But what makes it even sadder is the ending of Orpheus' life. According to one version of the legend, Orpheus was torn apart by Maenads. This term is translated as a mad woman, but it refers specifically to adherents of a violent and ecstatic cult of Bacchus, who was the god of wine and carnal pleasures. More on that later. For now, keep in mind that Orpheus' death was somewhat of a martyrdom. That is important, and soon you will see why. It is by now obvious that Orpheus is a complicated character. To pile on, we should mention a cult known as Orphism. Somewhere already in the 6th century BC, this arcane religious teaching appeared in Greece. Its doctrine was, as far as we know, based on the corpus of Orphic hymns, that is, the texts of hymns to the gods, the authorship of which was ascribed to Orpheus. Apparently, not only was he a martyr and a miracle worker, but also a prophet. In fact, we know little about Orphism. What we have basically are fragments of texts, and sometimes of very poor preservation. So we have a line here and a few lines there, and that's it. That's why we have such a sketchy idea of their doctrine. But one important aspect that we are aware of is creation of the world according to Orphism. And here is how it is usually described. In the beginning, there was a horrifying act of violence. First, Dionysus, god of wine that you are already familiar with, was born. And almost immediately, this divine toddler is torn apart by the Titans, those bloodthirsty giants. And not only they dismember him, but also devour his flesh. When Zeus sees it from above, he decides to intervene, being a little too sluggish for an all-knowing deity, if you ask me. He casts a lightning which evaporates giants into ashes. And it is from that ash that human race was created. Now, that perplexing story has nothing in common with Greek myth as they are normally told. But like I said, it is not so much a myth, but rather an arcane teaching in disguise of a myth. So, let's ponder the deep philosophical meaning of this parable. Humans were created from burnt bodies of giant merciless cannibals. As a consequence, we, as humans, consist of two natures. Our carnal part is what we inherited from giants. It is eager to kill and devour. It is insatiable, and it succumbs to death. However, there is a second nature within us. Now, can you guess where it comes from? Exactly. Our spirit is a vestige of divine child Dionysus, whose immortal flesh was consumed by giants. And just like they has tormented poor innocent child, so our spirit is being tormented by cruel desires and lustful instincts of our bodies. For our spirit is by nature pure and benevolent, but it is confined in the prison of our sinful flesh.